Okay.
Oh,
Might steal that chair back from you. Sorry.
Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome back to Tundra Buggy 1 on the coast of western Hudson Bay, live on the tundra, surrounded by polar bears. I'm just going to wait a moment to make sure people can hear me on the Tundra Buggy cam. So if you can hear me, if you could just let me know, and then we'll really dig into today's broadcast. Let's just wait a moment. So those of you who are possibly listening, you are watching a mom with two cubs on the camera. She is moving away with her cubs right now. So we call those cubs of the year, or kois for short. And they would have been born right at the beginning of this year. So they're coming up on their first birthday right now. So if anyone can hear me, let me know. And then we're going to start talking about today's theme, Polar Bear Citizens, what we like about you. And it's about positive news stories. Okay, BJ says you can hear me. Who's telling you that? Oh, thank you, Leah. Perfect. And thank you, BJ. Cool. We're going to get it kicked off. So thanks for those who are joining us. It is November 6th. We are outside of Churchill, Manitoba, Canada. Up north, we are watching polar bears, and we have been watching polar bears all morning. And some of you have seen some pretty interesting things this morning, and we're going to talk about those, as well as our theme of Polar Bear Citizens, what we like about you. So today's about good news stories, good things that are happening around the world, ways that people are getting involved for polar bears and for people too. And we're just going to talk about the importance of getting involved and how you can, take part in something going on near you. Of course, if you have any questions about these things or about polar bears, thanks. Now I've got so many people telling me they can hear me. That's awesome. If you've got questions, please do put them in the comment board on explore.org, or if you're watching on Facebook, pop them in there, and we do have a team that's going to be getting those questions over to me. So I am lucky enough to be joined by Dr. Steve Amstrup today. He is the chief scientist at Polar Bears International and has many decades of polar bear research under his belt. He was one of the folks that led the listing of polar bears in the United States to get on the Endangered Species Act, and he can talk a little bit about what that means. So we've got some great polar bear expertise on board for you. So I am going to start with a joke. Where do polar bears go to vote? The North Pole. Ha ha ha. So thank you to a friend for sending me that one. But, polar bears can't vote, but we can. So get out there and be a vote for polar bears and be a voice for polar bears today. I think there's some great opportunities to be heard and to get those in power that do care about the environment and taking action on climate change. So we are going to be showing you some great examples and circling back to that idea. But I do want to address first, before we get too deep, I know a lot of you watched what happened this morning with that mom who we think lost a cub. And I was wondering, Steve, if you could kind of tell people what they saw on the cams. So what they saw on the cams was this mom and one cub, and then the mom go get this, basically looked like a dead thing on the cam. It was hard to tell what it was on the cam. What was going on there?
So a male bear was able to catch and kill that cub and proceeded to eat it. This is a yearling cub, so just approaching its second birthday. The mother bear was apparently unable to protect that cub from the big male. But what was really interesting was that mother bear and her remaining yearling sat and watched for quite a long time while the male bear consumed most of that cub yearling that he had killed. And then when the mother had an opportunity, she dashed in, grabbed the remains of her cub, and ran off with it. And we're not really sure what might have been going on there. There might have been some maternal instincts. Clearly, these animals do have some feelings of loss. We don't know if it's comparable to what a human might have, but clearly some feelings of loss when a cub is lost. And so this may have been an effort just to go in and see what was remaining or what was really going on down there in the willows where this big male had the dead yearling. When she got down there, she grabbed the remains of that yearling, which was largely fur, but a few bones and some other larger parts, and ran off with it for several hundred meters. And then, interestingly, she and her cub settled down, and she actually started to consume some of the remains of that yearling. You might wonder, well, boy, why would she eat her own cub, or what was left of her own cub? And you know, these bears are hungry out here. This particular female is thin, and there may be some time yet to wait for the sea ice to come in. And so any source of food is probably valuable to her because there's really not much for polar bears to eat on land. And the other side that you might want to think about here is that all of the energy, all of the nutrients, or the vast majority of them that went into that cub to bring it to this stage in its life came from its mother in the form of milk, in the form of prey that the mother caught for that youngster. And so if the youngster is dead, having the female have an opportunity to reclaim some of that energy is probably a good thing. So a lot of complicated observations. We're not really sure exactly how a bear feels about some of these things, but what I've just described seems like at least a logical explanation for what we've seen.
Thank you so much for that explanation, Steve. I was so happy you're on board today with us to kind of help add context to the situation. It's important that when we're showing views like that and we're seeing these things happen, that there's someone available to kind of give information about that and put those sorts of activities and incidents into perspective. So the polar bears here, they are on land. Some of you have been watching the polar bear cam for years. Some are new. Just to add a little more context to what's going on right now, polar bears do need sea ice to survive, and their life is spent on the sea ice. That's where they make their living. That's where they catch their main prey, seals, and consume most of the calories, all of the calories that they need to survive via seal blubber and other marine sources of fat. So Churchill's a pretty unique situation. These bears are in Hudson Bay. We're in the western Hudson Bay polar bear subpopulation, one of 19 different subpopulations around the world. So there are many different places that do have polar bears. Where we are here, the sea ice completely melts in the summer, and that's why polar bears come onto shore. Of course, we're in the fall. You can see it's snowy. It's getting cold outside. So these polar bears are waiting for that sea ice to come back when it's cold enough. And hopefully that sea ice will refreeze soon. And as soon as it does, these polar bears will be gone. They do not want to be on land. They want to be out on the ice where they belong, eating seals. So when we see them here, we're seeing them in kind of this holding pattern. They're waiting. They've moved up to the coast, maybe from farther inland where they were this summer. And they're just kind of hanging out on land, conserving energy, waiting, and trying to find other sources of calories if they can. But the calories on land aren't enough to sustain bears. But we do see them eating what they can, hence, the dead cub this morning being consumed. So we have a special situation here where we get to bring you polar bear views for a couple months of the year, which is pretty exciting. And we get to talk to you about them and about how special they are. So great. We have a couple questions coming in, Steve, and then I'm going to talk about some good news stories. So they're all kind of to do with food, the questions that are coming in. So why would a male do that to a cub?
As Elisa was just describing, the bears that are here now on the shore of Hudson Bay are waiting for the ice to freeze, and they've been on land where there's not much for them to eat for several months. That means they're really hungry, and for a big male bear, a young cub might be a little bit of additional nutrition that it otherwise might not get. Now you might wonder, well, isn't that bad for the population? And in the big sense, what we think is that a male polar bear, if it can tell that a cub is not one of its own cubs, if it kills that cub, it makes room in the environment for its own cubs to more effectively compete. So that could have been part of what's going on here, but probably the biggest thing driving this was that it was a big male that was hungry, that had an opportunity to catch something as prey. And we have seen this before, where male bears will kill other bears when they're hungry and literally just consume them. So this is a matter of a predatory event, most likely. But because we can't actually go out and talk to the bears, it's up to us to try and figure out what the best explanation for this kind of behavior is.
And more questions coming in. These are really great questions. This is clearly a very interesting topic. So, Steve, why can't we just go around spreading out some sort of feeding stations for these bears while they're waiting for food?
A lot of people wonder, well, if these bears on the shore of Hudson Bay and elsewhere are hungry, why can't we just feed them? And there's a couple of answers to that. One is just the logistical and financial cost of doing such. Years ago, I did a little calculation of how much it would cost to feed these bears on the shore of western Hudson Bay, and it was over $1 million a month to get up here. And this is the most accessible population of any polar bear population in the world. So imagine trying to feed all of the polar bears around the world that are stuck on land. The cost would be astronomical, and with the additional cost of a greenhouse gas footprint, that is introducing more carbon dioxide into the atmosphere in order to spread that food around by dropping it from airplanes or however we might do it, would be a negative influence on the polar bear populations here, because it is the concentrations of greenhouse gas in the atmosphere, greenhouse gases like CO2, that are causing the ice to decline in the first place. So in the course of trying to save these bears by feeding them, we would actually be impacting them negatively by increasing the concentration of CO2 and other greenhouse gases. I think finally what we have to recognize is that we would have to do this forever if we don't stop the increase in CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere. In other words, it's not something that we would just do for 1 or 2 years and then everything would be okay. Unless we as humans stop the growth of greenhouse gas concentrations that comes from burning coal and other fossil fuels, we're going to continually have more and more bears on land, and we just can't afford to feed them all forever. The better solution is for us to get our act together and get out there, stop the rise of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, and save the polar bears and their habitat. And the best way to do that is to vote for people who are concerned about the future of the polar bears and our future as well. Because what's happening to the polar bears now ultimately will come to us. And we can stop this process and we can save the polar bears. And that, by doing so, will also preserve a better life for ourselves and our children.
Thanks so much, Steve. Yeah, it's important to remember that you don't have to do everything, but we need to do something for polar bears and for all of us. They don't get a voice, they don't get a vote, so we can be that for them. And there's a lot of great things out there going on that I know it can feel overwhelming sometimes, but I'm going to post a comment on explore.org right now, and I can also cross-post on Facebook. There are just so many fantastic examples of things that people are doing around the world within their own communities. So it's not up to any one person, but we can leverage our power as citizens and get involved as members of our community groups and organizations to protect polar bears and the sea ice they depend on. So there's a few great examples I wanted to highlight at first. One is, if you like to ride your bike, check out lovetoride.net. So that's all one word, lovetoride.net. And this website is run by an alumni of Polar Bears International's, Philip. He is absolutely fantastic, and you can see on this website you can get groups involved in biking more, you can get more people riding, spread the love, show your support for cycling, and get more people using different modes of transportation. So that's pretty cool. We also have some great articles from around the world here. We've got California, who's currently looking at a bill to set a target of 100% carbon-free electricity by 2045. So that's amazing. And things like that do need citizen support. And it's important also to remember that to not only get out and directly vote or voice displeasure, but also show support when you can for good things that are happening. So if there is a bill, if you are Californian and you support this 100% carbon-free electricity, it would be great if you could write your local leader and let them know that you think that's a great idea and you're on board. Because often those leaders are going to listen to the folks that are the loudest, who tend to be those that are against something. So if you get out there and you can show your support, that's pretty exciting. And myself as a Canadian, I show support for the Canadian government's carbon tax. So I grew up in British Columbia, and I think I was in my late teens or early 20s when BC started the carbon tax. And maybe there were a couple hiccups at first, but it just became part of the province. And I used to get, quarterly dividend checks and barely noticed a difference otherwise, but it did offer more opportunities for different types of energy sources, and made those that are doing the major polluting kind of turn that back and do different things with their carbon, get that carbon out of the atmosphere. When we're taxing carbon, those are the types of incentives that are gonna change what these big businesses that are doing the major polluting, what they're gonna do. Do you want to talk about the carbon tax for a second, Steve, and how Polar Bears International supports that initiative?
Yeah, thanks, Elisa. Yeah, Canada is really taking a lead here in trying to become the first nation that has a national carbon tax and dividend program. And very simply, the way this works is the more you pollute, the more you pay, and the less you pollute, the more you gain in terms of dividend checks, like Elisa was just describing that she was getting when she was living in British Columbia. And the fact that the government of Canada is trying to implement this countrywide is a huge step, and a real step of optimism forward for the world to see this example. Now, for those of us who live in the United States, there's a very similar plan that's been proposed by some of the actual Reagan administration aides that worked for the Reagan administration years ago. They have come up with a plan that's very similar to the Canadian plan, that if we endorsed it and embraced it in the U.S., it would be another very huge step on the way to saving these polar bears. One other thing that's really great about these carbon tax and dividend plans is that they level the playing field for renewable resources. And really, ultimately, the way that we need to live to maintain polar bears in our world is to live more sustainably. That is, to use fewer resources that are what we call non-renewable, like oil, gas, or coal, and more resources that are renewable, like solar energy, like wind energy, like wood and other plant fibers. And by doing these things, we can really make a difference in the carbon introduced into the atmosphere, and programs like the carbon tax and dividend level the playing field, making it more likely that we will do so. So here on Election Day in the United States, it's a really good time to celebrate what Canada is doing now, and to look forward to the United States hopefully endorsing and embracing these kinds of plans in the future.
Thank you so much, Steve. That's so true. And if you don't know where to start, if you're not Canadian, if you are in the States and you're not sure what's going on, it can be as easy as just starting with a Google search, kind of seeing what's out there. We sometimes tell students we talk to give their teachers and parents homework to just kind of check out what's going on in their community and see how you can get involved. So if you do need help, we have a great network of people we work with all across North America and even Europe. One good resource could be a local zoo, potentially. We have an excellent network of zoos we work with that do offer tools and resources for people to get involved in things that involve lowering carbon. We also have toolkits online that you can download. So whether you're interested in adjusting how you use your thermostat, or biking more or changing how you purchase food, whatever you can do yourself, that includes also voting. If there's other options you'd like to consider, please do check out our website and our toolkits to help you take those first steps. We want to empower you to feel like you can be a great polar bear citizen. So we are going to take a few more questions, and please do keep sending those in because there's a lot of fantastic questions coming in right now. So Steve, the female that we saw on camera earlier, she looked thin to the viewers. Is that normal for this time of year?
This is a time of year when many of the bears in this population are thin because they've been on land for 3 months or so, and during that time there's very little for them to eat. The scientists that have been studying these bears here for a long time have shown that they lose about 1 kilogram or about 2 pounds every day that they're without food on land. So we would expect these bears to be thinner now than they were when they first came off the ice, but some bears are obviously thinner than others, and that bear had 2 yearlings that it was supporting, this female that lost its yearling. And it also may be that she wasn't very effective at hunting when she was out on the ice before she came in. So she did indeed seem to be quite a lot thinner than a lot of the bears that we've seen. But we know that as the sea ice is forced away for longer periods because of warmer global temperatures, that there's going to be more and more skinny bears and more bears that look like her that have difficulty defending their cubs or even feeding their cubs. So most of the bears we've been seeing this fall have been in better shape than she is, but she is a good example of what we expect to see more of in the future.
Thanks, Steve. I have another question for you. Is the freezing of the sea ice getting later and later each year? And if so, by how much in days or weeks? And is this what's causing polar bears killing other polar bears?
I'll take the latter part of that question first. Is the declining of the sea ice what's causing polar bears to kill other polar bears? And certainly that sort of behavior we expect to see growing in numbers. We expect to see more bears killing each other as they have to spend more and more time on land, because with more time on land, they're going to be hungrier and they're going to be more willing to kill each other. We can't say that that's what was involved with this particular bear. And I think that's an important thing to point out, is some people might want to point at that and say, oh, well, this is the fingerprint of climate change. And we can't really say that, but we can say on average that these sorts of events will be increasing. The first part of the question was, is the ice freezing later now than it used to? And yes, it's freezing later, and it's breaking up earlier in the summer. So polar bears now are forced onto land in this area for almost a month longer than they were just 30 years ago. And during that 30-year period, this population has declined by about 30%. So there is a direct relationship between there being ice unavailable for a longer period of time and the physical condition of these bears and their ability to maintain their cubs. So ultimately, the loss of the sea ice is a real driver up here, but we have to be careful if we're establishing a cause for any single event.
Steve, is there anything for polar bears to eat on land?
The polar bears that are on land here do eat quite a few things. We often see them digging into the kelp. Along the shore of the bay, the strong winds here will often windrow or blow kelp up onto the beach, and bears are often seen in that kelp digging around, and they'll eat some of the kelp. You can see the little strands of the kelp being sucked into their mouth, almost like spaghetti. It's kind of humorous when you see that. But also I think that they're digging around in the kelp for other things. You can imagine that since this kelp is basically seaweed, it's big seaweed plants that come from the bottom of the sea and are broken off and blown up on shore, that there are probably some animals in that. And what we might have is some small arthropods or aquatic insect-like things, small things that are in the crab family, for example. And there might be some starfish or other small organisms that are in that kelp. But none of those things provide sufficient energy to offset the loss of seals that these bears have by not being able to be out on the sea ice. So yeah, there are a few things on land that they can eat, but they are energetically very poor. A great example that I like to point to of that is in northern Alaska, where I did most of my research on polar bears. We had a nice population of polar bears living offshore, thriving population back in the 80s of giant bears, but at the same time on land we had grizzly bears living, and those grizzly bears were among the smallest and most sparsely distributed of grizzly bears anywhere, and that's because the land environment in the Arctic is just a poor environment from the standpoint of a bear. So we can't really expect that these giant polar bears could come ashore and make a good living on a habitat that currently supports only small numbers of small bears.
Thanks, Steve. And polar bears do need sea ice, and the reason that we're concerned about sea ice is we are losing it due to a warming atmosphere. So as we're burning fossil fuels like coal, oil, and gas, we're releasing carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. And that acts like a heat trapping blanket. And in regular amounts, that's okay. We have a regular amount of heat. But we're releasing rampant amounts of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere and thickening this blanket. So we are just trapping too much heat too quickly. And I think we all know that ice does not appreciate heat. It just can't grow as well. So in places where we have seen sea ice loss, as Steve has said, we have seen declines in polar bears. And the issue with polar bear conservation is that it's not a fast conservation situation, basically. So if you think of maybe a forest ecosystem and you see the forest maybe isn't doing so well and you want to do something to help the forest, there's maybe more immediate steps that you can take. You could, for example, plant more trees. You could maybe put a fence up to keep something out or something in. You could even hire someone to patrol the forest and protect it. Really things that are attainable short term. When we talk about a sea ice habitat, which is just as important as any other ecosystem, we can't do things that are as immediate. We really need to be proactive. So we cannot put a fence around sea ice to stop it from melting. We can't hire anyone to protect it, and we can't just grow more of it. We do need to be thinking long term and working together to get that excess carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and cool our planet down and get us back on a better track. So sea ice, when you first look at it, it can look a little boring, maybe. It's, can look white and flat. It kind of maybe looks like the surface of the moon. It's totally bizarre that bears live there, let alone anything else. But if you take a peek under the sea ice, you'll see that it's like an upside down ecosystem in a way. And the sea ice is to the ocean what soil is to a forest. Underneath the sea ice, we have this kind of underwater garden. We have algae that's growing in and on the sea ice. They're the plants that are absorbing sunlight through the ice and growing that whole base of the food chain. They're feeding the microorganisms that are feeding the fish, that are feeding the seals, that are feeding the polar bears. So this whole ecosystem is connected. So to protect the polar bear is to protect the sea ice, is to protect that entire ecosystem. And Arctic sea ice isn't only important for polar bears, but it also acts as Earth's air conditioner. It's so huge and reflective that it reflects sunlight away from the Earth and helps keep us all cooler. And as we lose sea ice, we're reflecting less and we're absorbing more sunlight into the ocean, and we're causing this kind of positive feedback cycle of warming, which is not what we want to see. And some of Steve's work has shown that if we can get our trajectory under control, sea ice will come back, and we do have time. Steve, I was wondering if you could speak to some of your work showing that time remains if humans can come together and make some changes.
Yeah, we published a paper back in 2010 showing that there's a linear relationship between global mean temperature and sea ice extent. So what that means is that at any one time, if we can halt the temperature rise, we can stop the decline in sea ice. Now, ultimately, as Elisa said, we could, if we can figure out how to take CO2 out of the atmosphere, then we could actually make sea ice grow again. But the most important thing for right now is that we halt the rise of CO2 in the atmosphere and stabilize that sea ice. And it is important that we act soon because there's about a 25-year lag between the time that we stop the growth of CO2 in the atmosphere and the time that the sea ice would stabilize. So whatever's in the atmosphere now, we won't feel the final effects of that on the sea ice for 25 or maybe more years. And that CO2 remains in the atmosphere for a long period of time, for hundreds or even thousands of years. So right now, our best target is to try and stop the rise of CO2, to stabilize the climate, and then look at every creative solution possible to start to remove CO2 from the atmosphere. But we know we can do it, and an important point about that work that we did back in 2010 was that there isn't some kind of a threshold or tipping point in the relationship between sea ice and temperature. So as temperatures increase, we're not going to suddenly see a time where the sea ice declines irreversibly and just disappears. Rather, it's a gradual process directly related to temperature. And so that's a piece of really good news. If we get our act together and stop the rise of greenhouse gases soon, we know we can save ice for polar bears. And if we do so, we will save a climate that's very similar to the one that we've had for the last many thousands of years and in which humans have flourished. So when we go to the polls, like everybody is today, think about which of the candidates out there have expressed concern about global warming and the effects that global warming is having not only on wild animals like polar bears but on people, and consider casting your vote for them. The other thing is that, we don't just vote with our ballots that we drop in the ballot box, but we vote with our dollars, and we vote by trying to convince our friends and our relatives, our colleagues, about the seriousness of this problem. And by doing so, by sharing what you know, by sharing what you learn on this broadcast and other things that you can learn by looking at the PBI website, you can help inform a lot of other people that are in the circles you travel with or visit with, and really make a difference. So we have a great opportunity. People often say, well, do you still have hope that we can save polar bears? And by all means, I think all of us here at PBI do. And we are trying to encourage people to engage the courage to act, to vote in the right way, and to support actions by their friends and colleagues in order to save these bears and the rest of the environment that we really have come to love.
Beautifully said, Steve. Thank you so much. I think it's time for a couple other good news stories that we have to offer. One that we wanted to highlight was a Project Polar Bear team. I believe they're a Project Polar Bear team. But we have this fantastic school district in California, the Davis School District, and every February they put on a contest called Polar Pedal in honor of International Polar Bear Day, which is February 27th. So they get all the students in the district together, and they have a challenge of how many students can walk or bike to school each day. And every time the students do, there's a tally, and then over time, with X number of walking or biking to school, they do a polar bear adoption. So last year, the students totaled 9,071 walking or biking trips to school, and they were able to collect 18 polar bear adoptions. Over 1,000 kids participated, and they got outside even when it was near freezing. So thank you so much. That's an excellent example of a whole district coming together. So it's not just one person biking to school, it's a whole group. And we can, the more we act as communities, the more we can get done and the more change we can make. There's also another good news story that's been around lately. Many of you may have heard about the young people that are suing the government to do something about climate change. It's their future, and they want to take charge. And the Supreme Court is going to let it proceed, which is pretty exciting. So these 21 young people are seeking to force the federal government to take action to address climate change. And they are getting out there. I've met a couple of them actually a couple of years ago. Very inspiring young people. And I think it's just a really fantastic example to set that no matter how old you are, even if you're maybe not of voting age yet, you can still affect change in a really big way. So I wish them all the luck in the world. They're doing really great stuff. So we've got a couple more questions as well, and please do keep sending in if you have questions about polar bears or what we're doing out here on the tundra or anything. We're happy to chat with you. I am going to pop over next to our lovely BJ Kirschoffer, the Director of Field Operations at Polar Bears International and the main driver of Buggy One. And BJ can talk to you a little bit more about this topic, but we did have a question, BJ. Are our buggies electric?
You know, I wish we could say that all the buggies were electric. I think it's something that we could strive for in the future. You know, there's some really exciting stuff happening in that field. You look at some of the stuff that Tesla's doing and some of these other car manufacturers are doing with everything from, you know, electric cars to electric buses to electric trucks. I mean, this is a step that we need to make to electrify our transportation across the globe. So unfortunately, the buggies are not electric. They are diesel powered. We do have a big bank of batteries underneath this Buggy One, that allow us to broadcast, so we don't have to run a generator or an engine or anything like that during the day, as we're doing like we're doing now, speaking with you. But when we want to go somewhere, we do have to fire up the engine and burn diesel fuel in order to motor around. I would say that, you know, we don't do a lot of driving. You know, we don't burn a ton of fuel. You know, we do a lot of sitting, as you've probably noticed, and just watching bears. So, you know, we do our best to make sure that we're using fuel, you know, as conservatively as possible. But yeah, when we want to go somewhere, we do have to fire up the engine and motor. Now, some of the other cams in the area, if you maybe tune into the Cape Churchill cameras, those cameras are about 30 miles from here, and there's no power lines out there. We have to produce our own energy to make those cameras function. In the past, we used something called a methanol fuel cell, and that was a neat green technology that took you know, methanol and turned it into electricity. Now, the downside, it produced water as a byproduct, and if the thing ever had a little bit of a hiccup, it would shut down, and then that water would freeze. So we had to abandon that technology. It's probably better suited for a place like California than the Arctic here. Now we've got 2 solar panels there, and we have a wind generator. As you can hear probably on the Buggy One cam today, it's pretty windy here in the Churchill area, so the Cape Churchill cameras are probably doing just fine today off of those alt energies. So we are a huge supporter here of alternative energy at Polar Bears International, and it's definitely things that we need to be moving towards in order to help polar bears here.
Thanks so much, BJ. Now, considering that we're not yet there yet for having electric Tundra buggies, Steve, one of the questions we sometimes get asked is whether this sort of ecotourism and driving vehicles around to look at polar bears is harming the polar bears at all, or whether it's really, you know, worth it, and should people come here to see for themselves? What do you say to that?
That's a really important question, and at Polar Bears International, we think about that almost every day that we're out here. I think there's 2 parts to the answer to whether ecotourism is good or bad or neutral. One is that here in western Hudson Bay, out in the network of trails where people are allowed to drive these Tundra buggies, we don't see any evidence that the Tundra buggies are being bad for the bears in terms of their driving around on the ground. The bears that are in this network, they know that the buggies have to stay on the trails, that these Tundra buggies can't just go driving around over the tundra. They have to stay on these trails that have been here since the 50s or thereabouts. And so the bears kind of are comfortable with the buggies, and they come up and explore them. Rather than us trying to chase the bears around, they come and explore the buggies. So you can almost think of it as a zoo in reverse, where we're in these buggies that have to stay on the trail networks, and if a bear is interested in us, it might come up close and visit us. So I think that that's the first part, there doesn't seem to be any negative impact on the bears of having this tourist activity going on here. The other side and the bigger question is, well, what about the expense of the fuel that these buggies burn, and the fuel that's required for people to fly up to Winnipeg and then to Churchill to get out on these buggies? You know, there's certainly a greenhouse gas footprint for that. And so what is the balance between the knowledge that people get when they're up here and the cost of getting up here? Not just the cost in dollars, but the cost in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. And what we hope and what we believe at Polar Bears International is that by the opportunity to get people out to see these bears, that they'll learn about them, they'll learn what the threats are to the bears, and they'll go home inspired to make a difference. Last week we had a tour up here, our Conservation Journey, which is the premier conservation education tour that Frontiers North Adventures and Polar Bears International cooperate on, where 40 people come up. They know that they're going to be hearing from me and Elisa and others. We join them out on the tundra, and we talk to them and answer their questions. And on the second day out, one of the men who was on the tour came up to me and said, you know, I just didn't really understand this situation until I came up here. And he had already sent an email to his member of parliament to endorse the Canadian carbon tax and dividend program, because he could see that if we don't stop the rise of greenhouse gases, that polar bears are going to be in trouble. And so that kind of action is the kind of thing that we want to see. The week before, my niece from Chicago actually was up here, and she has 3 young children. She left here so inspired to go home and take action to try and inspire her friends, her neighbors, and to make sure she was voting for the right candidates, because she said, you know what? I've never thought about this in this way exactly before, but I need to go out and vote for my children and their future. And those are the kinds of actions that we hope people who come up here and visit with us and visit the bears will go home inspired to take. So that's a balance, and we're trying to figure out the best way to achieve that balance, but it's those kinds of inspirational stories that keep us thinking that this sort of activity, getting people familiar face-to-face with polar bears, really does, in the long run, benefit those bears.
Thank you so much, Steve. Those were impactful moments, and that's one of the reasons why we love speaking to you viewers and then meeting folks that come to Churchill and want to talk about the bears and how they can help. It's, really can be life-changing to watch polar bears out here, whether through camera or in person, and it's so important that we protect their future, and that means protecting our future. So really it's win-win. Our voice is their voice, and there are things we can do now together to make that difference. So a couple more good news stories we wanted to share. Let's see. One interesting one is that IKEA plans to only use renewable and recycled materials by 2030. So that's pretty interesting. IKEA is the world's biggest furniture retailer, and for them to use only renewable and recycled materials will hopefully set an example for other organizations like that maybe sell furniture. So Steve spoke before about there's different ways you can get your voice heard, and one is being an informed consumer. And now I'm not telling you need to go buy IKEA by any stretch, but one